having internet issues. Hey, hey, thanks for coming.
Eric is at work right now.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He says hi.
Awesome. Where's he working?
Over at Cricket right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Nice.
He's up at 5. He's just like, I wish I would have been there.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, I had to check it out because I've been interested in this topic for a while.
Yeah.
I heard even I'm sorry, did you just everyone's scared right now because it's spreading really fast. Usually I go to Walgreens. The first time I got it, within 15 minutes I made the appointment and I was in and out. I just went online, made the appointment, and I'm gonna head there in like 20 minutes. Done. So the second dose was a little bit more. The booster I was gonna make an appointment this week. I decided to just wait a little bit. And now I'm thinking, I think right now is gonna be the worst time to go because everybody wants to get the booster. That's fun. At least I think that, well, if I do, I want to do it on a Friday. So I can just relax on the weekend. Yeah, I have to worry about it.
You can go around that way. Yeah, she should be in the back. I think she's in the restroom.
Well, the staff that are too, so I'm wondering like,
All right. Well, I think that's probably going to be most everybody since it's rainy and wet and all that kind of stuff. So thanks everyone for coming who's here. I'm your historian. I'm Francisco Ramos. That's my office over at the front. I'm a graduate from UC Riverside in history and history in ancient European medieval history and a minor in law and society. And I know Maria is too from UCR, so welcome, fellow Highlander. So today is going to be a presentation on the former Indian boarding school that was here called St. Boniface. St. Boniface was here for over 50 years. That started in the 1890s and was eventually torn down in the middle 1970s. So this will be a brief overview of what the history of the school was, what happened to it, and kind of what boarding schools were like in general in Riverside County. You can't see the slide I have because I'm not sure how to go back, but there's a couple things I want to say before we get started about what this will cover and what it won't cover. First off, if you have questions, save them to the end because we may answer them as we go. It's a pretty thorough presentation. Secondly, is that this won't be on the cemetery that's still at St. Boniface. There's a lot of questions regarding the cemetery, who's interred there, what's happened to the land. We'll touch on that at the end, but it's such a deep subject on its own that it's worthy of its own discussion. So We'll cover that in the coming year as more developments happen, as there is currently with the site. And third, this is not about the Canadian the Canadian Native American boarding schools. The Catholic Church had different sects run different schools with different administrations, different ways of doing it. There's a whole controversy right now about mass graves in Canada. That did not apply here. As far as we know, there was no mass grave at St. Boniface, so I don't want to give the impression that they're somehow tied together. Other than being Catholic, there are big differences between the two systems. So regarding that too, also we'll touch on Sherman Indian School. Sherman Indian still is a federal program that was now put into private hands in Riverside, which had some students flux between the two institutions, but it's also separate and apart. So we won't touch on that, but kind of illustrate to it in the future. And then also a lot of folks now in recent years that look at history and they'll say, well, I've read this or I've read that, and it comes from TikTok or it comes from Facebook or it comes from somebody saying something they saw somewhere else. And for our purposes, we have 4 sources that I use for this slideshow. One is this book here. This is called Readings in Diocesan Heritage. This was written in 1994 by the San Bernardino Archdiocese archivist named Dr. Bruce Harley. Dr. Harley went through all the archives for the local San Diego, San Bernardino, and also Imperial County Diocese archives, collected them, collected the letters, collected the communications, went to all kinds of different archives over the United States and put them into this book. So we take this book with, a good helping hand of kind of a grain of salt, because it does kind of, go over the basics of what happened to the school administratively. And it doesn't talk about the student perspective very much of what Native students had to go through daily in being a part of St. Boniface or other local area Catholic institutions. So it's very helpful for the history and the chronology of the way the history played out, but it doesn't give the student perspective necessarily. So it's a good resource, but as long as you have that context, it's good to keep that in mind and thinking about that. Also, Boarding School Blues. This was a book written in the early thousands by Professor Trafser over at UC Riverside with Lorraine Ciscock, who is a Native American descendant whose great-grandparents went to Sherman Indian Institute. It is the seminal book on Riverside County and Inland Empire boarding schools and what the students' perspective has been in history regarding those institutions. So it's a huge, important piece to local Indian boarding school history. And if you can check that out, please do. It's also readily available on Amazon affordably. So if you can, pick up a copy, and it'll cover a lot more in detail of the student's perspective. And then also, too, I've done my own research with the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Carondele. That's the local sect that was in charge of the faculty. And so they were there for 50 years at St. Boniface and have their own archive in St. Louis at their national headquarters. And I've retrieved some of the photos from their archive. And so you'll see pictures, letters, and some other paraphernalia that came from that archive, and it will be cited as such in the presentation. And then also what we'll get to very shortly is I've also read the report of the Indian agent named John Ames. And in 1875 and 73, he came through Riverside, what will become Riverside County, and gave a detailed report to the United States Congress on what Indian affairs were like and what the need was for boarding schools. And so we'll touch upon his report very shortly thereafter as well. And so how do we get here? How do we as a country decide that we need to take Native Americans from their own reservations and put them into schools? And why do we need to do that? And it really ties into 17th and 18th century thinking. Some of the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, John Knox, who was the Secretary of War at the time, really thought that not only were we an expanding country, but we were a country that needed to assimilate the Native Americans as they were going to be either pushed out for the United States or incorporated into life. And so part of the structures of that was making sure that they were raised and inducted into American society by people of good moral character. And good moral character often meant that they would be people that were Christian. And so in March 3rd, 1819, the United States government created something called the Indian Civilization Act. And in the act, this was the bedrock of creating the education system that created boarding schools in the United States. And this quote I have here comes from the act. It says, lawmakers designed the act to civilize Indians, indirectly to Christianize them. Under the terms of the act, the president could employ persons of good moral character and instruct Indians in the mode of agriculture suited for their situation and for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. very basic things. They were not interested in creating scholars or people that could maybe rival folks at other institutions of such. But that was the overall plot line for getting Native Americans into American society through lots of heavy industrial labor. So that's a quote that comes from Boarding School Blues, and it's also in the Act of 1819. And then we get to the Catholic perspective. So because the Catholic Church has been a huge administrative system throughout European history and into American history as well, the Catholic schools were seen as some of the best institutions that could be used as partners with the United States government in actually creating a boarding school system. And why would they do a boarding school system? Well, there had been a school created in Pennsylvania called the Carlisle Indian School. This was created by a guy named Captain Pratt, and Captain Pratt was a warrior of the Indian Wars. So after the Civil War, the United States took it upon themselves to expand into territories that were given to the Native Americans, and annexed them or took them over in various respects, and had literal wars and battles with them. And Captain Pratt was a veteran of that, so he believed that the best way to integrate Native Americans into American society was to break them down by deincorporating their native languages, getting rid of their native religious structures, and making sure they had no opportunity to fall back into the old habits of life, which really meant taking them from reservations, putting them in a boarding school, putting them into a very militarized style of education with drills, with uniforms, with daily activities that were rigorous, and making sure that they had something to do at every point in waking hour. And the Catholics also, for a large part, believed in the same type of regimented lifestyle as well. As you can see here, this quote comes from this book of Diocesan Heritage. It says, most of the time is spent at the school of St. Boniface. We try to give the children a good Catholic grammar school education, keeping in mind always just what sort of home conditions the child will most likely be surrounded after the 8 grades shall have been completed. We do not try to educate those for city life. I think that's very important right there too. They're not looking at full incorporation into white Anglo-Saxon living, but into just reservation life, and who will most likely remain for the rest of their lives on reservation. So a narrow scope, obviously. Continued, it says, we do not believe in giving every Indian child the idea that it should go through high school only. Only the exceptional ones are encouraged to go to high school. The majority of Indian children, and more specifically those who are to remain on reservations, have sufficient education with the completion of 6 or 8 grade grammar grades. We have a follow-up system or an outing system, and this is where it gets really kind of blurry with almost indentured servitude type of conditions, where they take girls, and they said here the last 10 years, they took 50 Indian girls from doing ordinary housework and cooking and gave them to better Catholic families. This was done to give them an idea of what a Catholic home should be like. Often the scattered villages of Indian reservations like the Papago, which were in Solar in Arizona and the upper Mexican border region, they have little idea of the real Catholic life as it should be. They are indeed Catholics, but they should never seem any real devout Catholic life as it should be in the family. After the girls remain there for about 3 or 4 years, they usually come back to their respective homes and settle down. And on account of the experience, they are so much better equipped to find better Catholic homes on the reservation. The problem is with the boys. They too would like to get out and make a living with little money they get to start on their own home later. But if he gets a job in a large city and finds no companions of his own kind, he will usually gravitate to the lower strata of civilization. If it works out of town, he will get dissatisfied for the same lack of proper companionship, and sooner or later he'll want to quit. The girls have a clubhouse of their own, and they come together every 3rd Sunday of the month and see each other and have a good time and talk. But for the boys, no such place has been found. Besides, the employer rarely takes any interest in the boy. It makes no difference at what time he returns at night, as long as he is on the job in the morning. The girls are treated quite differently and must be obedient to the rules of the outing system. We've had excellent success with this plan for the girls, and they have turned out very well and make very good leaders in their own villages and among their own people. And so this letter here comes from one of the administrators of St. Boniface, which was a report from Father Gerard to the Catholic Indian Bureau, which was the national organization that took care of the Indian boarding schools. So you could see already the mindset of what the system was, which is create laborers, don't create much else. They're not great for other things. They're not going to go on to be scholars. They may not be inducted into normal Anglo-Saxon life. So do the best you can and give them the basic education that they will need to subsist in labor-like conditions. And so that's why I created this side, which is the education is segmental and it's not complete. Because today in public education, we're always preparing for people to go either into trades or into higher education, and we encourage both as an education system. But then at this point in time, it was a radical thing to do because there was a very much an othering of Native Americans as being dumber, less than. What Captain Pratt at the Carlisle School instituted was an idea that you will kill the Indian to save the man, which meant that there's a soul in there that God loves and blesses, and through us we'll be able to extricate that. But really, the Indian needs to go away first and stay away for them to be saved. So this is the context that we're coming to. It's a very negative way of thinking about other fellow human beings. And so now we get to the founding of the school and to Father Hahn. And Father Hahn is the third administrator of the school, but he is the longest lasting at the school. And we'll talk deeply about him in a second. It was not the first industrial school in Riverside County, but it was the longest lasting. The other school that was Catholic based was one in Paris. They were, I think, around the late 1890s into the early 1900s, if I'm not mistaken. But due to a water crisis, they collapsed, and some other factors as well. So they're no longer around. And then there's Sherman Indian Institute, which is a completely different non-religious based institution in Riverside. But this was the most important one here, and it was known nationally as such. This was an extension of the United States government coming and doing a field report in the 1870s with the local Native Americans. That man that came was John Ames. He was the local bureau agent. And on October 3rd, 1873, he reported to Congress the letter that I'm about to show you about what the conditions were like and what he actually saw on the ground. And to be fair, he didn't think of Native Americans as subhuman. It's not quite as drastic as we saw the letter from Father Gerard in the 30s. He does recognize that white settlers have infringed upon the rights of Native Americans, their treaties, their rights to their personal property, to their own public safety. But he also sees that they can't coexist as well. So he kind of balances the two, and you'll see that right now. So this is from his report on page 4. And this is when he went and visited Agua Caliente, which at that time was called the Quahia Valley. Based on the language group of the Quahia folks. I asked them how they would like their children to go to school and to learn to speak English language and learn to live more like white people. It'd be very nice, they replied, but it would do them little good if their homes couldn't be protected. They had been stolen from by settlers. They were distraught and moved from their groves where they were growing dates and other kinds of local crops. And so they were always being moved around by the next settling population that came through. And so when Ames later asked about moving them to a different location that could be secured by the federal government, the locals replied, "Our fathers lived and died here, and we would rather live here than in any other place." And it's the homeland. It's the place that the creation gods like Takwitz and others give them in the stories. So of course they weren't going to leave. And so he goes on and says, at San Pascual and Agua Caliente, it was called upon by white settlers, a majority of whom had no good word for their dusky neighbors. They were thieves. They were treacherous. They were vagabonds. It was urged that they should be taken to some of the territories and surrounded by soldiers to keep them at home, or to some island in the sea. And I found, however, little in my journey to confirm such opinions, but was glad to note many indications of thrift. I could wonder, indeed, that they were as reliable, honest, and peaceable as I found them to be. The sentiments entertained by the very many white men in Southern California toward the Indians are well illustrated in the condition to which the proprietor of a small ranch near Temecula came in presenting the subject to me from his standpoint. So he's saying there's a disconnect. There's obviously an in-between where there's Indians being infringed upon and there's settlers that don't like their presence at all. And as he continues, he notes the mission system, which had been the Junipero Serra system of the missions all up and down California and the Camino Real. That's the one he's referring to here. They created great farmers out of the natives, and they could be used to further the civilization of the Quahia. That's the older style of writing. And San Diegan Indians. This was San Diego County at the time. There was no Riverside County at that point. Ames concludes his report by reporting to Congress that the best solution to protect the Indians from the white settlers' abuse and to bring them into society is to create one huge tract of reservation for cultivating. But even in his report, and it's 12 pages long, you can find it in the Senate reports, it says that's going to be impractical because they all have different religions and bases and they don't speak the same language. So I don't know how you're going to do that, but obviously they should be given their own land that the settlers can't infringe upon. And so, with that, the report gets sent to Congress, and Congress then starts to contact folks in the Catholic system, and they start subsidizing Indian education schools. And so, the bishop of the Monterey, Los Angeles Diocese here, this Bishop Francis Mora, which was almost 80,000 miles. I mean, that's how big this diocese was, all the way from Monterey down to the now modern Arizona border. Decided on May 12th, 1878, a plan to erect an Indian school here in the San Antonio Pass. Now, why here in the San Antonio Pass? Well, he heard through the voicings of local priests that it was an important place in the region because it was the easternmost portion of the Monterey, Los Angeles Diocese. And it was important because there had been multiple tribes that live here: Serboba, Morongo, Serrano, Agua Caliente, Pachanga, so many different tribes and cultures that you could put one school there and actually get a multitude of Native American tribes involved. So the location for their purposes seemed to fit. This photo comes from our own archive. This is the stop about 3 miles away, the original train station. And in 1888, Bishop Mora sent staff from the Benedictine sect, which were the sect in the Catholic Church that actually did most of the Indian education here in this area, to the pass. He sent a subordinate and also a local friar. They arrived at the Banning train station to oversee which lands they were going to buy with the Bureau of Indian, a Catholic Bureau of Indian Affairs, of which farm was going to be suitable. And they actually stayed in Beaumont. They stayed at the prior settler of Beaumont's home and went to Banning back and forth in those early days. So they went around and they looked at Dr. Wellwood Murray. Dr. Murray, it was one of the early settlers here. He also is credited with helping create some of the first sanitariums and hot spring resorts in Palm Springs. And it's because of St. Boniface. The Catholic Indian Bureau purchased his farm. It was up on the hill. It had a good water supply. It had a clear orchard that was able to be cultivated and used. And they thought it was perfect property. They bought hundreds of acres from his farm. And so after that, he moves to Palm Springs and he creates the sanitarium with the healing waters, as you see there. And this is him in 1901. It's actually kind of hard to find a photo of Dr. Murray, but we got this one from the Dehaney Memorial Library in LA. This is his home. It's it used to be on Murray Street, intersecting with, I think, Indian School Lane, and it's no longer there, unfortunately, but it was one of the oldest homes in Banning. And it later was the home for the priests as they lived and worked on the school site. The cost of the school was $18,000, which is well over $500,000 today in creating the school. And the school was constructed in an interesting fashion because they used local labor, so local white Anglos. Chinese laborers were used to make the bricks, which created this school chapel, and also another one that was eventually demolished in the earthquake of 1889. And the local Chinese laborers are known for making very good solid bricks. Some of their testimonies are actually in our own archive. And from the start, the financing was always a problem. There was never a consistent amount of money coming from either the Catholic Bureau of Indian Affairs or from the United States government and giving a sufficient amount. So the local diocese had to either loan out loans to the administrators of St. Boniface or find very wealthy patrons that would subsidize activities. And it never left that situation. And so we enter Mother Drexel. Mother Drexel is a titan in the Catholic Church for being a major philanthropist because she was an heiress from Philadelphia. This is her here. And as the construction of the school ended in 1990, the financing continued to be a problem. They had to open and they didn't have tooling to work the fields. They didn't have enough cattle to make sure there was a proper farm and so on and so forth. So they reached out to Sister Drexel and they said, we've got a great area here in the San Antonio Pass where your education system, your mission, which was increasing Indian boarding schools and Native American schools just for Native Americans, would fit well here in the pass because it's so close to so many other tribes. And she was working in that back east, obviously in the Philadelphia region. So they said, come out here. It's better area. It's better land, better weather. You'll do much better here. She went on to found the only Catholic All-American, African-American, Catholic university in the United States, which is Xavier University in Louisiana. It still exists today as a historic black college. Oops. Okay. So after she was approached by Monsignor Stephan of the parish, he asked her, create a mother house. I don't know if you know what a mother house is, but it basically is the central HQ for your sect. So if we had Benedictine monks here and we said, well, we want a mother house for, your high administration, that would be the place where the mother, the administrator, would go and do her operations from. So they wanted her to actually be really involved in the local administration out here. And she did decline, but what she did do instead was she decided that it was better to fund all the tools and equipment that needed to go into the school. And so what she gave them was $40,000 at the time for the site, which was kettles, animals, tools for farming. There were some leftover tools from Dr. Murray's and his operations there, but it wasn't enough. And she continued to give donations until 1936. So she was the main enormous benefactor of the institution outside of the other Catholic funding structures. So now the tools were funded, they were ready for day-to-day operations, but their pupil population was still lacking. And so they needed income from the different education things they were going to do. And so they approached the federal government and they gave them $150 per pupil. So it's several $1,000s today per head. And at some point in the late 1890s, the federal government stopped funding Catholic schools. This is her later on. She became a patron saint in the year 2000. She was, I forgot what the term is, but made a saint by Pope John Paul II. And she converted at the age of 31 and donated her entire fortune to Catholic programs. So she is a huge titan for education in the Catholic Church. And this is the main man. When you think of St. Boniface, he's on the cover of the book also. This is Father Florian Hahn. This is him in 1891. He would have been in Ohio at the time, running the Rensselaer School, which was an Indian boarding school there as well. And this photo came from the Precious Blood sect, which was his sect from Cincinnati, Ohio. He was not the first administrator. He was long lived there. He worked there for 30 years, and he was the third in line. Father Willard, who was the prior administrator, passed away. And the other one that started the operations to get the monks and everyone else out here was only temporary. So he really takes the school and launches it into its daily operations. And he's in the same vein as Junipero Serra. He is considered still, even in this book and amongst other people, in the Serran Club, which is a lay Catholic institution that works in the vein of Father Serra as a real titan of recreating the mission system in his own vein with these boarding schools. He's credited with creating over 13 in Southern California in his time out here. So he's creating new missionaries. He's become a great missionary, and he had a lot of influence in different schools. These are some churches and school sites that he either influenced or helped found. One of them on the top is Florian's Mission Chapel in Palm Springs. This is a photo from 1912. And this is a different chapel, much later though. It was after he had passed when this particular building was erected. This is at Torres Martinez Reservation in Thermal, so way past near the Salton Sea. And these photos are rarely seen. They come from the Sisters of the Carondele Archive in St. Louis. And this is him here. This is him in Banning. He's at the home of Charles Omar Barker. And Charles Barker was a huge industrialist and farmer here in the area, and a very wealthy man indeed. So he knew all the local folks. He was always trying to raise money and awareness for the school. But about him, he was born in 1850 in Germany. He learned a printer's trade, so he knew how to run an operating press and knew how to be a reporter on the beat, so to speak. And he was ordained into the Congregation of the Precious Blood. He was later appointed to be the superintendent of the Indian School in Rensselaer, Indiana. So he knew how to run Indian schools, how to raise money for them and keep them operational. And he was primed for working in this area with this new school. So Bishop Mora knew that he was one of the best in the field and that he was somebody that could definitely take St. Boniface to where it needed to be. And that's how he became part of the program down here in Southern California. This is another very rarely seen photo. This also comes from the Sisters Archive. This is the St. Boniface Press. They wrote a publication quarterly called the Mission Indian, and the Indian Sentinel as well. He is not actually credited as authoring the different articles that are in there, but we all know to understand that he did write them. And he wrote, and even in 1899, a very chilling account of what happened to the school site and some of the buildings that were affected by the earthquake there, which did partially destroy some of the wooden structures and the stone structures here at St. Boniface. So a rarely seen photo. And these are some Native American students running the press and printing blocks. So this was going to be my photo. I couldn't find it, but there were 7 sisters that came to be the faculty of the school, and here they are. So, in reaching out to teaching sisters, the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Carondele also did other Indian schools and were known as teachers. And so they were recruited all the way from St. Louis with 1 month's notice. So the sisters wrote back and said, wow, well, we're not sure if we can get you the faculty in time. So we'll do our very best. And sure enough, they did in 1 month. And they got on the train and came all the way out here to Banning. And this is the list of those that came. Celestia Riley, Sister Anna Francis Stack, Gonzaga Cui, Sister Alphonse, Celicia Early, Virginia Joseph Byrne, and Mary Lydia Bulger. A lot of them were Irish immigrants or European immigrants as well. So they were from a diverse community in their own right. And so we've got another person coming in. Hello. So this is a quote that the sisters are attributed to of what they were doing when they were coming and giving an Indian education. Their activities could be best estimated as follows. These cultured, educated, religious women came from St. Louis to convert Indians. They were willing to face the heat, the dirt, the impoverished living conditions, limited to water supply, to teach Indians, to bring them with the knowledge of God. With usually over 100 Indians in the boarding school, they meant the sisters washed, cleaned them, and cared for them during good health and in sickness. It also meant that they were with the Indians day and night. And with a population at that time that was almost 200 students when the school opened, it's quite a huge student to teacher ratio. So they had a lot to do, plus managing the farm and doing other administrative duties. And so where were the students? Where do they come from? In the book and also in other sources, they came from a variety of local tribes. Quahia, and Quahia is like saying American, basically. That means Morongo, Agua Caliente, a lot of different local Inland Empire tribes. Serrano, Diegans. Diegans are from what we call modern San Diego County. It's also a very vast group as well. Luiseños, Tuleris, a geographical stretch from Escondido all the way to the San Joaquin Valley. Huge amount of land. And in later years, a relative of a Papago Nation chief also extended to St. Boniface. This was in the 20th century, and that's also in the Arizona border region, so a very, very large expanse of territory. And these sources are from the Diocesan Heritage Book and also our own archive. And so where do the students go? This has been a big question I get often from folks researching their family and their histories. And it seems that the church tried to get them in contact with their families, at least during the summer months or also when school was out. And it was a huge task. During the summer months when the schools were not in session, Father Hahn would take to the homes of their period and were locally based. And he would ask others to pick them up if they could. Most of the time they couldn't. So he would arrange a caravan. He had 2 horses. One was named Billy. And they would get a gigantic caravan of students and go down to Hemet, all the way down to Escondido region to try to disperse most of the students there for the summer months and come all the way back. The journey took weeks. And so a frequent stop was in Hemet. There was one hotel that would be open to housing the sisters and also himself, but the students actually had to sleep outside for the evening. So unfortunate, but in the book and under the letters that Father Hahn wrote, he said they were comfortable outside, kind of in their native element, as he is alluding to. Yeah, you could kind of see a theme here. And so how did the students live on campus? What were the conditions like? This is going to be the Catholic version. This is what they wrote about it. And what they wrote and what the students experienced were often 2 vastly different things. So this is another Father Hahn publication, Indian Sentinel, 1905 and 6. Daily routine. It's several pages long, but they get up at 5:30. They go and look at the mass that's being given. There's a daily routine. They get breakfast at 7:15. After that, then they do sweeping, dusting, making beds, washing dishes, helping in the kitchen. So immediate labor is already apparent. And within 2 hours, you're up and doing stuff laboriously. And then they go and they get a good morning greeting from their teacher. They start their lessons. They get dinner at 5 o'clock. And then after that, they'll go and play some customary games. There is drilling. There was a Native American school band as well. It was well known in the area. Father Hahn taught them how to play every instrument in the band. They had to go do laundry, go do sewing classes, kitchen classes as well. They were preparing their own meals, helping the sisters with the other kitchen duties. Running the bakery, which was sold local baked goods in the community as well. Farming and horticulture. They did canning. They made olive oil, which is well known for its quality in the region as well. Plus the 40 hours devotion, so doing a lot of other different Catholic rituals and things during the year. So it was a jam-packed day from morning to night if you were a St. Boniface student. But this is what Father Hahn says they do. And then from the students' perspectives, how do they feel about this and their lives there? What were their feelings at the moment? And this is where we've got some scans from local students who went there. And I didn't get time to put it into the slideshow, but this is from Inez Moss. She's passed away now, but she gave a testimony in the Press Enterprise in the middle 80s. And she said, I remember being really scared. It had to be when I was in high school at Sherman Indian Institute, but I remember that I was scared. The nuns were strict, very strict. They kept getting me in trouble. One time they caught me running around the hills in which I was off limits. The nuns switched me, which means they hit her with a limb from a tree. Another time they knocked my head against the wall because I threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria, but I was naughty. I sang in the choir. I liked that. I liked working in the kitchen, but mostly I didn't like the school. So there's always these kinds of testimonies of physical abuse, not getting enough to eat, bad conditions. The federal government in late 1890s did another report that showed that they didn't have enough adequate supplies for a lot of the schools across the country in a different report that you can still find today. And then there's even more testimony from the Boarding School Blues book. And it says here, the priests and nuns found a pattern of reservation using the students to do hard labor that was not matched by the non-sectarian counterparts, like Sherman and like others that were not based in a religion. They did masonry, carpentry, mechanics. Most of the other off-reservation schools didn't do that. They had some chapels there. They were Protestant and Catholic influences, but it wasn't as bad and as heavily, religiously based as it was here with St. Boniface, obviously. Some students liked it. Some students found it influential. Some didn't. The book is full of these different interviews of what was done between the two different schools and how the different students felt about it. Some of the people that went back home felt that their own communities criticized them because now they were anglicized. They didn't have their own language base anymore and their own religious basis to look upon. So they not only suffered sometimes at school, but also when they went back home. So it hit both ways in that sense. Very militarized, like I said, following Colonel Pratt or Captain Pratt's model. At the Carlisle school, most of the schools followed heavy militarization, drilling, and practicing. So you were pretty much tired morning, noon, and night. And so this is also how internally the administrators felt about some of the other students that were at St. Boniface, because as time goes on, the Indian population gets smaller. There's less funds coming from the Catholic organizations and also from the federal government, which stops completely in the 20th century. And so now they're taking in students that are from social programs like county programs from Riverside County, San Bernardino, San Diego County, Imperial Valley. They're getting the social welfare kids. They're getting foster kids. They're getting kids that are orphans. So they're seeing more African-American students, some Asian students, and a lot of Hispanic and Mexican students. So this is another letter. Remember, we read Father Gerard's letter before. Well, we're going to read another letter, and it's also from him to the Bishop of San Diego Diocese. Let's not forget that. 1939. Most Reverend and dear Bishop, with the sincere greetings of this holy season. It's lovely to hear these sentiments when you get into the meat here. I wish to thank Your Excellency for the return of Father Philip. I do hope he helped in the work you had planned for him. I'm glad he's relieved. There's another matter I'd like to touch upon. Ever since I spoke to the good Father McInkster, and after having read the Carta Abierta, I've had very serious doubts in my mind as to the wisdom or prudence of disturbing these letters of our people. He goes on here. He goes, I know for a fact that the people of Banning and Beaumont, Cabazon, Palm Springs, Indian, and Coachella are ignorant of the trouble. There were students and people that were getting really upset with the conditions at the school. I believe they are the very best way to profit from the situation is to refer to it as little as possible and to let it blow over. I have lived with the Indians and Mexican peoples for what are the Mexicans, but the Indians of Mexico far too long to become excited or upset by anything they say or do. There is a certain type among them that if one wishes to be of help to them, must be treated just like children. That is, listened to, but not be taken serious at any time. Since they are with us, they must adapt themselves, and especially to American ways. Naturally enough, the majority of the adult Mexicans, especially those who were born in Mexico, will ever want their language, customs, devotions, fiestas, he says. And as they enjoyed them in their own country, it must be as it always was in their country. Otherwise, it is un-Catholic! Exclamation mark. With the younger generation, with those who are growing up under our own conditions, it will be just a question of time and if they will have adjusted themselves. So the entire outlook is not hopeless, nor will your excellency's charity remain fruitless. So he's talking about the donations again. He wants to make sure that they're actually still giving monies, right? I have witnessed similar difficulties among the passing generations of the German, the Italian, the Portuguese, the French, and especially of the Polish immigrants. Blessing your excellency's blessing, I am yours humbly, Father Gerard. Okay, that's not great. And obviously they should be referred to as children. So whatever the complaints were, obviously it was enough for Father Gerard to write a letter to his bishop, and he clearly decides, I know them, treat them as children, and move on. So here's what the bishop writes back. This is December 21st, 1939. And he says, Dear Father Gerard, let me thank you sincerely for your cordial favor of December 18th, which was the last letter. Your experience with the Mexicans and the years you have spent working among them would make you an authority on the subject. Under the circumstances, I believe your views are correct. On the other hand, we have obligation to instruct and educate the Mexicans as much as possible, especially if we have the duty to teach them and to emphasize in the season and out of elementary facts about telling the truth. So he assumes they're all lying. They are like morons or like half-witted children to tell lies and think no one will ever check up on them. When they do have trouble, they are easily misled, and leaders are generally rascals, as were uncovered in San Bernardino. Not sure what he's referring to there. But it is true that certain types must be treated like children, but we can never indulge them in their lies and trickery. For example, an old trick among the ignorant ones is to get up a petition and forge 90% of the names. We simply can't wink at that type of dishonesty. It is significant, however, that the only 2 Mexican parishes in which we've had any trouble were staffed by the Augustinian Recollects. We've had occasion to make many changes among pastors of Mexican parishes, and to date there has been no trouble except in these 2. So he's probably referring to Banning and Beaumont. In both of these parishes, there are snakes in the grass who insisted on letting the trouble blow over, but kept it up. But for your present, let the matter drop altogether in Banning and with the parishes that you serve. Someday I will have a little chat with you regarding this matter. Renewing my good wishes for a blessed Wistmas, he misspelled that. Believe me always, your devoted servant in Christ, the Bishop of San Diego. So that's scathing. They're morons. They're not worthy of anything. What makes my mind kind of curious is, what was this petition he's talking about? Obviously, I meant a group of people decided conditions were bad and should be addressed at a higher authority. And he says, well, forget it. That's what they think of the students. So you can imagine probably following up on the quality of conditions and things like that was probably not high on the list. So now we're going to get back to the timeline. This is the end of the Father Hahn years. He passed away from a heart attack in 1916 when he was traveling in Oxnard, California. There were dignitaries that came from all over the United States and the Catholic world to pay their last respects. And in this picture here, you have almost a who's who of founding fathers of the city of Banning. You have Mr. Hathaway, who was the first mayor of Banning, Charles Omar Barker, who is pallbearer here, Mr. Hathaway, as well as on this other side, he was, like I said, the first mayor. Mr. Holcomb, who created one of the first shopping blocks here in the district. And then also Mr. Gilman is over here on the side, famous of Gilman Ranch over in the northern part of town. They were not Catholic, but his influence in the community, plus raising it into more of a proper 20th century community, was well known, and so they came to pay their respects. So after Father Hahn dies, things start to really kind of go south administratively for the school, because the school is now aging. Its buildings in the 20s and 30s were now, 30 years old, because the buildings were made in 1890. They needed repair, but the money's weren't there to repair them. The school population is growing. And now there's a request from people in the areas to do day school. So they wanted parochial instruction. So they had a problem. In 1919, the director of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, which owned the land that St. Boniface was on, he deemed it worthy to influence the Franciscans to take over from the Benedictines that were there. He wanted to expand the territory as well, and so they did. And it now was going all the way to the Sonoran Desert to New Mexico and getting students to come to St. Boniface. The cash flow still was a problem. In 1920, they had 120 students. There were still a lot of full Native American students, but a growing number were Mexican, African American from Catholic families in the parochial day school. By the 50s, the day school students would overtake the Native American students in the population. By the 20s, the federal government largely got rid of their financial support for the Catholic Indian schools. They were supplemented by local Riverside County programs for their children that were in the care of the county and other areas, orphan children, and social welfare children. Despite the funding sources, they did not operate to an extent that would satisfy their own internal markings inside of the church, and the buildings continued to degrade. So by the 30s, the Catholic Bureau was now giving to the local diocese $10 a head for the tuition of Native students, capped at 90 total. So more students, and yet they're getting less money. So the problems are compounding. So for comparison, at the beginning of the school opening, they had 200 students, and by 1943, it was 125. So roles are reversed, and they're still having problems getting more money. In 1950, they had 70 students. 20 were Native American, 50 were day scholars. And the school would sponsor an annual outdoor barbecue festival, which would help raise awareness for the campus. Frank Sinatra came in the 50s and sang at the school, and he was escorted by the chief of police of Banning to go and do this concert. He was a very well-known philanthropist. He gave much money to the hospital in Palm Springs as well. So he was well known to be a supporter of the school. And now you see the decline of the Franciscan administration into the middle 20th century. And after World War II, there was a problem. The brothers and the administrators were elderly now. They were no longer on top of their game. It was so bad. In 1950, the bishops saw that there was another problem with a different parish in Beaumont. A Mexican mission in Beaumont was severely damaged by an earthquake in November 1948. The Franciscan padre had not informed the San Diego Chancery that the disaster had taken place, or that they needed to take extra steps to take care of their flock. And a seemingly steady deterioration of the situation led Bishop Buddy, who was the bishop of the archdiocese, to pressure the Franciscans into giving up the Indian system here in the Pass region. And this became a huge controversy internally. It was so bad, the Franciscans actually appealed to the higher authorities in Rome. And the Roman delegation sent out people to investigate the situation here on the ground. They deemed the bishop was correct. They were aged, not communicating very well, and things were deteriorating. So they confirmed the decision of Bishop Buddy to get rid of the Franciscans and remove them entirely. And by 1952, they were gone. And in the newspaper, it says that. And it says the community supported these brothers, that they loved them. They had long-time community ties to them, but internally, it wasn't going well. Now, by the 50s, the internal Catholic Bureau of Munitions, they stopped donating per pupil to St. Boniface. They were still getting donations from benefactors. So now they had to do other things to increase revenue. In 1953, they added the 9th grade. By 1959, all high school levels were added. And in the 60s, now things really started to degrade for the buildings. The school plant was not upgraded or maintained since the 20s. And so many of the old buildings were taken down, and when they were taken down, they were never replaced. So the school changes, and then it becomes Boys Town, USA. So the administrators then were now divided amongst different local sects. There were no longer one sect becoming the administrators. There were just a bunch of different local priests that were taking over, such as Reverend Joseph Sadler. They wanted to model the St. Boniface School off of a successful one called Boys Town, USA, which was in Omaha, Nebraska. And when they did, they made a big publicity about it. They added a pool, some recreational facilities, and it became an all-boys school in the future. But it still didn't work, and there was still not enough money. And then at one point, the diocese decided it was better to start fresh and create another campus in Beaumont, which eventually took over all the operations and became Boys Town, USA in Beaumont. And so by the middle 60s, they created a new campus, so completely modern buildings in Beaumont. The construction was done with a loan from the Bank of America worth $2.5 million, and they broke ground in 1967. And by the 70s, Beaumont campus was swelling with students from local county programs. The city of Banning then condemned and demolished the St. Boniface School in 1974. By the 70s, the property had been bought and sold to various developers. It still has changed hands even to this day. And the cemetery was then given over to the Morongo tribe so they could work with it and preserve it. And also the Riverside County Historical Commission has also worked to create a marker there in the 70s, and with the tribe and other folks on marking it and preserving it. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of what the timeline of St. Boniface was. It was enthusiastically supported from everybody in its beginning, and then had a very slow, steady decline through aged, benefactors, aged people running the administration, not getting enough money to support upkeep, and students obviously having a difficult time with different things that they had to do there. So in January, we're going to invite Lorraine Ciscock, who is one of the co-authors of Boarding School Blues. She'll be coming here to talk about her archival experience at Sherman Indian Institute, and also her grandparents that went to other Indian boarding schools. And Marianne Andreas, she is a tribal elder from Morongo Band of Mission Indians. She was one of the former tribal presidents, and she attended St. Boniface for a very short time. So we're actually going to hear firsthand from people that know people that went to Indian schools or had gone to St. Boniface, and we're very excited about that. So if you want to hear more about the daily interactions or more of what the contextual history is of Riverside County and its boarding schools, please come out for that. That's happening next week on the 5th. And then our last thing too is I get a lot of questions from folks that have descendants that went to St. Boniface or that went to different Indian schools, and they want to know, well, how do I find out if my great grandparents went there, or if I, want to educate more people about it? And there's a couple things you can do. The Catholics have taken a lot of their information from all the different institutions in America and stuck them at Marquette University. And so if you go online to marquette.edu/archives Indians, you'll find their whole history is there. There's photos, there's catalogs, there's all kinds of primary source materials there. I've used their archive, and it's very, very good. And then also for the local diocese, because the Sisters of the Carondele were the primary teachers of St. Boniface throughout their entire time, they're the ones that have a lot of the local education information. So their archive is in St. Louis. You can use their site in person, or you can ask their archivist to send you records. The things you've seen in this presentation were taken from their archive and scanned and sent to me digitally. So you don't need to go to St. Louis to access that as well. But that concludes my presentation. I hope you found that educational. And if you can help someone learn about local Indian boarding schools, now you have some resources to do that. So thank you for attending. If anybody has any questions, looks like none on the chat so far. Any questions or comments?
When you talk about the Beaumont campus, are you referring to the Catholic Church as a campus, or just a campus in general?
It was a campus in general. It was a whole separate thing. There's other parish churches there. One of the things that the school had a problem with here in Banning and in Beaumont was those local churches were growing. So here in Banning, there was Precious Blood Church. And in the 50s, they created their own parochial school. So suddenly they were competing within their own community for the educational rights. More and above that, the district decided that they were going to send 7 sisters over to Precious Blood and also to a different school in Beaumont to be the teachers there as well too. So suddenly there was now a brain drain in the middle 50s for educators here at St. Boniface. So a lot of different factors, they never really got together to say as a whole unit, we're going to support this. This is how much money you're going to get. This is the teachers you're going to have, and just continue forward. And it's just a Band-Aid kind of, snowball effect that kind of led to its eventual closing in the late 60s. So it's a whole different campus. It's something else now. It's no longer a boys' town. I think it's a Merv Griffin, USA. If I'm not mistaken, I might be. But it lasted for a bit longer in Beaumont. Yeah. Questions, comments? Are you horrified? Are you? What? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I have another comment.
Yeah.
I know that there's a burial ground right next to it. Is that connected to St. Boniface with the boys that are buried there?
Yes. Yes, there was in the late 1890s, the United States government did an internal report where they looked at the conditions of a lot of the Indian schools in the Catholic control, and they were not good. And they found that a lot of them died from either unsanitary conditions, improper feeding conditions. It didn't necessarily apply to St. Boniface. I don't want to give that impression, but as a whole, conditions weren't great. And then when you take folks from an environment where they're used to living with a certain diet and you transform that into something else and throw depression in and separation anxiety and PTSD on top of that, quickly a lot of folks started to pass away. So that combined with a whole other factors is why that cemetery is large. And so over the years, some of the first interments, like Father Hahn is still there. Father Willard, who was the, I think, second superintendent of the school from 1880, he's also, I think, interned there as well. There's some sisters that are also interned there too. So
At the same little
here,
burial by Gilman.
yes,
Oh, they're there too.
they're there.
Oh,
Yes.
wow. I thought it was just boys who were buried.
No, no, there are sisters there. There are faculty. There are Anglos that are there. Yeah. There have been surveys and different things done with the site. So I won't get too much into it because it's all within the jurisdiction of Morongo, and I believe Agua Caliente too. So the developer that bought it gave that cemetery plot to them to decide what to do. So no one has influence over it except for the tribe. So the tribe will decide basically in the future how to preserve it and what will happen to folks that are interned there, or how to memorialize it better.
Because anybody could just walk up to it. I'm surprised it's not barricaded a lot better. Even the school too.
Yes,
It's not protected.
it has been for decades, been vandalized
Yeah.
and been trampled upon. And the markers that were there, the headstones have been removed, knocked down, defaced, really been trashed in the years prior. So it's been a sad end to the cemetery. So I hope in the future it will be better managed and secured.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be up to the tribes to figure that out. Yeah. Okay, well, that's it. I'll stop recording.